Welcome aboard Rocket Ship, the platform with the most relevant content for competitive examinations. This is Rocket Ship IAS Lab and continuing with our series on answer writing for general studies papers of civil service main examination. We take up a question that you might come across in GS paper 2. Here goes the question. Nari Shakti Vandan Adhiniyam 2023 that ensures desirable representation for women in Lok Sabha and state assemblies is a welcome step. But more must be done for women to have adequate say in policy making. Discuss. So the question starts with mentioning a particular legislation, that is the Women Reservation Act, or rather as it is named Nari Shakti Vandan Adhiniyam 2023, and goes on to say that while it is a welcome step, that is providing reservation to women is a welcome step indeed, but more must be done if we have to ensure that women's voice on the public forum gets adequate weight. What we are doing here, we are essentially citing some data to establish the whole idea that women need reservation in the legislative bodies. That is, in the just concluded general elections 2024, 74 women candidates have been elected to the 18th Lok Sabha. It at less than 14% of Lok Sabha strength, women's representation in the House is much less than desired. Again, this point does not need much explanation that women who form almost a half of the population have barely 14-15% reservation, in fact less than 15%, and in fact less than 14% as well in the Lok Sabha, that is the House of the People. It's the same story almost across all the state assemblies as well. To remedy inadequate representation for women in the legislative bodies, the Nari Shakti Vandan Adhiniyam 2023 was enacted. The act inserted, that is the Nari Shakti Vandan Adhiniyam Act, inserted Articles 333A, 332A and 239AA to provide for 1/3 reservation for women in Lok Sabha, state assemblies and the legislature of the National Capital Territory of Delhi respectively. Actually, Article 330A deals with reservation for women in the Lok Sabha. Article 332A deals with women's reservation in the assemblies, and Article 239AA provides for reservation for women in the Legislative Assembly of the National Capital Territory of Delhi. The reservation will be applied on rotation basis with 1/3 seats reserved for women for 5 years and so on. That is in the second 5-year term. A further 1/3 of the seats will be reserved, while reservation will be removed from the first 1/3, and in the third 5-year term, that is in between the 10th and 15th year, it is the last 1/3 of the Lok Sabha seats or the assembly seats on which election will be on which reservation for women will be applicable. The legislation is a welcome step as it affirms inherent equality of women, makes the democratic discourse more diverse through women's participation, and can bring to fore issues of concern from women's point of view. So you could say the points on which this legislation can be praised are that first, it provides reservation to women, which is from the point of view of inherent equality of women, very important, that it affirms that the women are inherently equal to men in all regards. Moreover, it also means that women can contribute to the discourse and make it more diverse. And third, it's possible that with the women's representation in the legislative bodies, their voice would have greater weight, and moreover the issues which are specific to women will have, you could say, greater space and time given for them to be discussed. However, more is required, as the question itself was saying, for women to get adequate say in policy making. Therefore, women reservation should be supplemented. What we are saying here, that women reservation should be supplemented, that additional measures are required with steps to empower and facilitate women on public forums. That is, we have to first make the women powerful enough to have their presence in the public forums, and we have to actually facilitate them, handhold them, etc. So what are the supplemental, you could say, steps required, how we can supplement women reservation? First is through internal democracy in parties. That is, women reservation should not be beyond tokenism. That is, generally the political parties mostly do lip service when it comes to political, you could say, adequate representation to women. We must also create a safe and favorable climate for women. For an example, they should not be, you could say, castigated. They should not be trolled for, you could say, minor mistakes, or for that the, you could say, a stand that they take. Refuting patriarchy that subconsciously doubts women's capability. Nowadays, mostly people are not going to express their patriarchal views, but we can actually confess that most of us do have some patriarchal traits which we subconsciously hold. Ensuring that dynastic capture does not defeat the goals of the legislation. Again, this is a very, very pertinent point, that if you could say the same problem of dynastic politics, the same malady, the same disease of dynastic politics would to affect the women's reservation provision as well, what it would mean, that the political dynasties would essentially capture all of this mechanism. They would take recourse of women's reservation to have the women from their own families elected, and that would essentially defeat the entire purpose of, you could say, giving reservation to women, so that more women from diverse sections, from diverse classes are represented on the legislative bodies. It is moreover incumbent upon women to prove their worth. Again, the point is, we are appealing to women that they are not lesser to men in any sense. So again, it comes to them, it essentially goes to them, that they have to prove the naysayers wrong through their performance. Now, taking up these points in detail, beyond lip service to gender narrative, political parties should usher in democratic working where women can rise to the top on their own merit. Again, you are probably aware that mostly the major political parties, it's mostly the major political parties, they do, you could say, theatrics in the name of adequate representation to women. You might recall that one of the political parties was actually saying that they would provide nomination to 1/3 of the, you could say, women, of the total nomination of their political parties to women. But what they indeed do, that they chose the seats where they were not even in contention, where they were weaker. Actually, they were politically weaker for the women to fight, and the result was most of the 1/3 of the women candidates were not even elected. So the point is, essentially the political parties have to go, you could say, a great deal of soul searching, and essentially bring in internal party democracy, where anyone, for that matter, not only women, will have the ability, will get the chance to rise to the top at the, you could say, back of their own merit. A safe and favorable climate where women politicians are not trolled for small mistakes, and where they are encouraged and appreciated. Where the women candidates, or sorry, the women politicians are appreciated is needed, so that even if they were to make small mistakes, we should always encourage them that they have to again continue. The subconscious patriarchal urge to deny women's successful track record should be called out. Comments dismissive of women's capabilities should be rebutted. Again, the point is there is no empirical data that women are lesser than men. And in fact, in many areas, they have proved to themselves to be quite capable and sometimes even more than men. Certainly not less than men. So that is the point, that all of these, you could say, the patriarchal, you could say, mindsets, questions about their capabilities are unfounded, that they are non-founded. This disease, the contagion of dynastic politics, should be prevented from capturing seats reserved for women. Women rights groups and aware citizens should be on guard if politicians attempt to hijack reserved seats. That is, the reserved seats should not be allowed to fall in the hands of the dynastic politicians just to advance the interests of their political dynasties. Having already proved themselves in areas as diverse as sports, arts, profession, and whatnot, women do not lack successful role models in administration either. We are not going to name them, but in the recent memory, we can actually cite the name of two important women politicians who did not even come from dynastic backgrounds. That is, they mostly rose to the top on their political parties at the dint of their sheer hard work, and they took their political parties to great electoral results. So the point is, women in no way are inferior to men in any sense. This applies to women politicians as well as is applies in the areas as diverse as sports, arts, profession, and so on. Through pursuit of a more honest, compassionate, and result-oriented politics, women politicians will not only prove the naysayers wrong, but also become a you could say virtual alternative, a viable alternative for voters. The point is, the women politicians are generally considered more honest. They in fact display more, you could say, passionate, you could say more compassionate, more compassionate stance towards the weak and the vulnerable, and moreover they can be as result oriented as the male politicians. Through all of this, through all of their performance and these, you could say, essential traits that are peculiar, they are particular to women mostly, they can actually prove themselves to be as capable, if not more than the male politicians as well. And that way they would prove to be viable alternatives for viable alternatives for the voters, even compared to the male politicians. That was all on additional measures that are needed to make the, you could say, the objectives of women reservation, you could say, more, you could say, more viable. So this was all on what more should be done to make the women reservation more effective. That is all for today. We would reassemble for the next lecture in a few days. As usual, we wish you all the best. Thank you.